Welcome and good day, and welcome to another episode of the Sunshine Podcast, an outreach of Sunshine Free Will Baptist Church here in Huntington, West Virginia. My name's Levi Johnston, seated at the table with Lee Green, Kenny Hatfield, and Pastor Jody Fortner. If you're new here, let me tell you a little about what our podcast's about. A few of us get together once in a while and talk about things of interest, particularly about the Bible, Christianity, family, theology, apologetics, and generally sharing our experiences and thoughts with each other at this little table situated in a Sunday school room at church. And we're letting you in on a set of conversations we typically have anyway, sometimes in here, sometimes outside after church, headed to the cars to go home, but we get caught up in conversation and forget to go home until our wives start honking the horns or texting us, where are we? What I want to talk about today is sort of more in that conversational tone. Think about some of the sermons, some of the church services you've been in that were the most impactful to you, something that sticks with you, something that seems to always come to your mind or something. And I'll start with one. I was probably about 17, living in Lincoln County. There was a pastor there. His name was Dave Callison, one of my favorite pastors growing up. Pastored Yawkey Methodist Church in Yawkey. What he used to say, he was raised Church of God, went to a Baptist college and taught at a Methodist church. And, but now Dave passed away in June 2019, and I still have a lot of fond memories of him. One of them is because when I was 17, he had a youth revival at his church, and he was really big into, he would always go to the football games at Duval, where I went to high school. He was the unofficial chaplain of the football team, and he loved the youth. His church had a setup. It's a tiny little church, but they had this setup in the front for puppets, and so they did puppets every week, and the kids would get involved in it. And I mean, he was really involved with the youth. So I remember specifically this youth revival. I think it may have been the first youth revival I remember going to as a teen, at least. So here we are in this youth revival. I remember the back row, or the back 2 or 3 rows, were all football players. They were all paying attention. They were there every night. This one particular sermon I just really remember, it's always stuck with me. So he preached on Isaiah 64:6, and that's the verse, but we are all as an unclean thing, and all our righteousness are as filthy rags, and we all do fade as a leaf, and our iniquities like the wind have taken us away. And so that was his key verse. And he came in, he had this really nice suit on. I remember it being kind of a silvery gray, almost had a kind of a sheen in the light. It's a really, really fun preacher, really engaging, really not overly loud or anything. He's just, you paid attention when he preached. So he gets to the point of the verse, our righteousness is filthy rags. I remember him tying it in with Matthew 23:26 through 28, when Jesus is talking to the Pharisees. And he says, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are like unto whited sepulchres, which indeed appear beautiful outward, but are within full of dead men's bones and of all uncleanness." And so, as an object lesson, I guess, he starts unbuttoning his suit jacket. He takes his suit jacket off, and his shirt underneath, what you could see behind the jacket was white. As he took the jacket off, everything below where the jacket covered was cut in pieces, was dirty. It was like mud on it or something. He really just messed up the shirt from there. Now the reaction was mixed. Some of the football players, but I mean, it made an impact, and that sticks with me all the time. Is you see this nice put together person, he takes off this jacket, and there's the rags. And so that's the one I was 17. I still think about that a lot. So that's mine. That's one I think about a lot. So what about you guys? What do you have?
So when you asked, or when you sent that out to think about that, the first thing that came to mind was a sermon that I heard when I was a teenager as well. And I would say it was impactful both positively in I was a teenager who didn't want to pay attention. It was good if I was awake is kind of where I was at. I was not saved until just 5 years ago. And but for some reason, this sermon has always stuck with me. Pastor at the time his name was Conley Goad. He's a friend of my dad's. My dad's known him for a long time, and we had kind of been in some different churches for different reasons without going into all that. And this was the church. It was a Justice Free Will Baptist Church that we attended probably the last, maybe all of my high school years. So we hadn't been there like my entire childhood, but I had known Conley for a long time. He always had this joke, one of the funniest guys you could be around. He had these blackberry bushes around his property, like thousands of them. You could go down there and get buckets and buckets and buckets of them. But he always said one day he was going to, when I was big enough and thought I was big enough, that I could try to pin him down and rub a blackberry on his nose. And so I think one day, as a teenager, I was big enough and thought I could, and it kind of was back and forth a little bit, just joking. And he's, older. He's older than my dad, probably by 15 years at least. So now he's 80 or maybe in his mid 80s. So this would have been 20 years ago. So he would have been in his probably 60s doing this. He pinned me down and rubbed a blackberry on my nose. And so I had purple stain on my nose for a few days. But anyway, it was just all in fun. But the sermon that he preached was on the 10 Commandments. And it was the first time that I had ever heard, or that I had ever paid enough attention to hear the connection, such a connection between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And you would think that, that maybe you would have paid attention to that earlier, but I hadn't. And so when he starts talking about the Old Testament 10 Commandments, and then Jesus talking about the 10 Commandments, really explaining them deeper as it relates to how we've maybe perceived them as, thou shalt not kill, thinking literally don't kill someone versus, you shouldn't hate someone. And so he went through all of them. The way that he explained it was that, we've all broken the 10 Commandments. And so for me at that time, there was a lot of thoughts and it was the best sermon I had ever heard and the one I had paid the most attention to, and I was excited about it and kind of wanted to know more about it. The negative impact of that, and this I think is really just sad, it was that he wasn't wrong in what he taught that day and what he preached on that day, but the church elders were highly offended, so much so that he was no longer the pastor after that. Having had been at other churches where pastors had been removed or for whatever reasons as a kid, and the church splits had occurred as a smaller kid, this was probably the third time I had seen church split or a pastor be removed. And then now all of a sudden, my parents didn't want to attend this church anymore. They thought that it was wrong, that had happened. It wasn't going to be a place we were going to attend anymore. So now here we are on a third in my childhood, my youthful years, I guess, we're changing churches again. So I don't know. That's been one that I still think about. I wish that hadn't happened that way. I was not involved in the church enough as, being just a teenager to understand exactly what the problem with that was. And I don't think my parents were members either yet, because we'd been there for a little while, but they weren't members. So it hurt them too. And so here we are, this person that, we knew and had known for a while, and we didn't feel had preached a sermon that was wrong, and then he's being removed. So anyway, I enjoyed the sermon, and it was the first time that it kind of resonated with me about the connection there of the Old and New Testament as a kid, but at the same time, then that negative impact. And I don't want to blame the church elders there. It does kind of always come back on me as my own relationship with God. But then when I left my home, when I left Gilbert and came to Huntington, I tried not to go to church for another 14 years or so before I was saved. So I'm not going to say that specifically was the reason I started to reject going to church, but anything that you do like that has a ripple effect and an impact on people. Mm. If you're not rooted in the Word of God, and if you're not, maybe you just don't understand correct doctrine and correct Bible teaching, then you're going to be offended by things. But anyway, that's kind of the one that stuck out to me when you ask us to think about that. And I wish I had a better one that was all excited and happy, but that's what I got to share today. So
for me, a sermon that sticks out to me, this was kind of hard to answer a little bit. Not that I couldn't think of a sermon. It was the fact that my pastor, who's been my pastor for the last 11 years, is sitting across the table from me. And over these years, I've heard hundreds of sermons, teachings, preachings that he's done. And I've loved them all. Some have stuck out to me more than others. But it is not one of his. And that's what makes it hard to answer. But if it's any consolation, this one that sticks out to me, in a sense, it's recent. It's recent to me, but it was actually preached probably before Jody's great-great-grandparents were even born. This was preached by Charles Haddon Spurgeon in 1859, and it's entitled Little Sins. Whenever I try to share that with some people, they may look at me and say, well, all sins are big. There's no little sins. Well, in the context that they're saying it in, I can agree with that. But the context that he's preaching it in, I also agree with what he's saying. He's talking more of the subtletiness of sin. Of course, big things we're going to avoid. Murdering, stealing thousands of dollars or something like that. But the small things are easy to sneak into our lives, easy for us to say, oh, well, it's just this small thing. Everybody's doing it. It doesn't matter. I mean, my boss can see me take home these box of paper clips and he doesn't care, or, something along those lines. But he just talks about the subtlety of sin and how some of the points that he made in that was that little sins lead to great ones, that little sins multiply very quickly, and that little sins involve a great principle. Again, the whole context of it is the subtlety of sin. One of the movies that I've seen, one of my favorite movies, it's A Storm of the Century. There's part towards the end where the congregation or the townspeople are taking a vote on something. One guy is definitely against it, against everybody else. He's like, this one person is against it. And anyways, when they go to take the vote, he doesn't vote. And his wife turns to him and says, this isn't a vote of what we're going to do. This is just a vote of, do we believe what's going to happen if we don't make the right choice? And he says, I know what this is about. But he says, quote, once we start down that road, every step of the way gets easier. And in that sermon by Spurgeon, I think that's kind of the underlying thing, is that you take a little sin, something that, maybe you say something behind somebody's back and don't really think too much of it. It was said in private to a husband, a wife, a friend, something like that. And then that leads to them talking about it, and you talking about it more and more, and it just kind of grows from there. I have actually an audio clip that's only about 27 seconds long that I'd like to play. This is actually from that sermon.
Dread sin. Dread sin. Though it is ever so small, dread it. You cannot see all that is in it. It is the mother of 10,000 evils. The mother of evil, they say, is as small as a mustard seed. And certainly, the smallest sin has 10,000 evils sleeping within its heart.
In that last part, the smallest sin has 10,000 evils sleeping within its heart, really spoke to me when I listened to that sermon. It's like a seed of an apple tree. You have one little thing, very tiny thing, and he actually kind of references something like this in the sermon, but it's a very tiny thing, and nobody would even think twice about it. But when you plant that seed grows up into an enormous tree that produces more seed and more fruit. That seed goes to seed and produces more and more. And so that from that little tiny thing, this monstrosity has now arrived. That sound clip and really the sermon in its entirety, I've probably listened to the entire thing probably at least 15 to 20 times. My kids are really tired of it. They will, anytime I play the sermon or the audio clip or anything like that, they will try to cover their ears or walk out of the room or something like that. So naturally, the clip that I just played a minute ago, I had to set it as their alarm for them to wake up with. Noah, my son, when the first day that it was set for his alarm, his response was, he just woke up and said, "Really, Daddy?"
If you can wake up and roll your eyes, that's the sound he made.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And Molly kind of had a similar response to it. They're both tired of me listening to Charles Spurgeon. So that is one that I actually started listening to either in 2021 or maybe late 2020. So it's recent to me, but it is a very old sermon. So that's probably the one that's stuck out to me the most, the one that's most impactful.
We had a youth revival here a few years ago, and one of the messages there was a slow fade, and it was about how falling into sin it's not usually a fast drop. It's a slow fade out of it.
So I think for me, so when we got the message, be thinking about the sermon. So immediately, just in my mind, I started processing, but nothing came to my mind. That just stood out. And Brother Carl Lilly was our pastor most of my life, and I think the world of Brother Carl. And I thought, if he meant so much to me, how come those messages, how come those sermons just don't stand out? I will say this: one of the things that I just remember Brother Carl saying, and I can hear him say it again at the end of a message: "Today is the day of salvation. If you hear His voice, harden not your heart." So I started thinking, why can't I just think of just this great, great sermon? And I thought, well, you know what? Sermons are there to instruct us, and they're there to feed us. I don't remember what I ate last week, but I know that I ate. And I thought, you know what? I'm thankful for all of the years, even though those sermons don't stand out to me. I'm thankful that I was fed spiritually all of those years. I'm not going to talk about maybe a sermon that just did all of that. I'm just thankful for all the sermons that may not come to my mind immediately of all of those things, but I know that I was fed.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, that's an awesome way of looking at that. I really like that.
I wish one of my sermons came to mind.
Lee doesn't feel as bad now about not picking one of your sermons.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Now, one other one I've thought about. I went to a revival in Chesapeake, Ohio, over here, and your Uncle Willie May preached there. One of my favorite quartets sang there, tribute quartet. So this was, I want to say 2019 probably. I've heard of this sermon that Brother Willie preaches. I'd never seen it until that night. And so I guess he has sheep, and he preached on the lamb. And in the middle of the sermon, he brings out one of his lambs, and all these verses corresponding to the lamb, and kind of passes the lamb across the audience. And the quartet that night sang a song called One Holy Lamb, which is an awesome song. Put a link to it down in the description. It was so impactful. It was exciting. That was probably one of the loudest revival services I've been to. They sing the song like 3 or 4 times because it never calmed down. It was awesome.
Another one that kind of comes to mind, it wasn't really a sermon, but it was, I guess you could call it a 5-second sermon. In the late 80s, the church I went to, the preacher there, every time the service would end, he would usually be standing by the back door like you do a lot of times, shaking hands and everything. And as soon as the person would finish praying, he'd always say, "Be good, kind, friendly, loving one towards another." And he would always say that intentionally and purposefully, meaning, listen to this. Even though it's 5 seconds of something you've heard me say every sermon, that sticks out in my mind. And I remember one time, I guess he was trying to get down out of the pulpit area to the back door, and the person who was praying was very quick, so he was still walking up the aisle. And he was even saying it then, they said amen, and he's like, I got to get to the back door, but he's like, be good, kind, friendly, loving one to another, as he was like trying to rush to get, to where he could shake hands and everything. So that, I guess, 5-second sermon has stuck with me all these years too.
I love hearing all of your different experiences, and there's still quite a few to come, I'm sure. If you're listening and you have any kind of church service or sermon that kind of sticks out to you, or something that's really impacted you, we would love to hear about it. Go to our website and send us a message, or just tell us if you see us in person. We'd love to hear about that kind of thing, and how someone preaching or someone has reached you in special ways, because we're all working together. We're all trying to reach each other, to impact each other, to impact the unsaved. It's a group process. It's everyone's individual responsibility, but we all work together and just to impact people for the kingdom, for Christ. We'll take a little bit to get a stretch, and we'll come back and talk about something a little different. While we're taking a break, we'd like to invite you to visit our website, sunshinechurchwv.org. At sunshinechurchwv.org, you can find out more about our church, about the pastor, find some of our podcasts, watch our church's live stream on Facebook, and ask us a question. If you go to the Announcements tab at our website and click the link called Sunshine Questions, you can submit your question or comment or concern, and we'll try to address it here on the podcast. If you'd like to listen to our previous episodes, we have a special website set up just for that. It's thesunshinepodcast.com. We feature each episode as they come up, show notes with links to some of the stuff we might talk about, and sometimes we even put up some pictures as well. That's thesunshinepodcast.com. And now we'll return to finish the podcast in progress. All right, welcome back from the break. We're going to continue our discussion, but we're going to kind of turn the page a little bit. So we talked about some impactful sermons that we've heard. And you go to church long enough, you have this standard things that happen, and sometimes things don't go according to plan. And so turning the page from what we talked about before, can you think of some things that may have gone wrong or turned out funny, I guess? Something that didn't turn out the way it was supposed to be, and it just changed the tone of the service. Or I traveled and sang for a few years, and so we were in different churches every week, sometimes 5 times a weekend, sing out in fairgrounds and all kinds of things. So there were a lot of times just things didn't turn out the way we expected. And so I thought it'd be fun to bring back some of those types of memories.
I have one. The first thing that came to mind, I was at a small church kind of out in the country, not very high ceilings. And I just remember that there was a wasp flying around. And it didn't really impact the preacher. He just kept preaching and, nothing changed there. But everyone was becoming more and more aware that there was a wasp. And it would take its dive down. And, of course, you see an entire row, like, dodging it. Yeah, so I don't know that it was funny as much as everyone was kind of scared. They didn't want to get stung. I've been stung in the last 6 days twice, just this week. So anyway, it's been a great week. My ankles swelled up. But anyway, I just remember that happening just constantly. You'd be watching it and you couldn't really listen because you don't want to get stung, and I remember my dad being like, that's the devil. He's, it's Satan attacking this service or something like that. It was something like that, but it was just funny. And I don't know if he was right or not. I mean, maybe, I guess, kind of in a way it was, because it did distract everyone. And I don't have a clue what was preached that day, or I don't remember much of the service other than the wasp that was, only about 8 feet above our heads or 6 feet above our heads, diving down on all of us.
It was almost like the Mississippi squirrel revival.
Yeah, with a wasp involved instead of
the West Virginia wasp.
Exactly.
Well, the only one that kind of comes to my mind is back several years ago, there was somebody who was going to get up and minister in song. And the way they were dressed, it wasn't inappropriate like what their shirt said or anything like that, but they were in T-shirt and shorts. Generally speaking, that wasn't a big deal, but he was getting up in front of everybody to minister. And the preacher, I can't remember how all this, the timing of it went, if he went to him before the service started and said, you're not going to sing, or how, if it was like the service had started and then he realized. But anyways, he goes up to him and, I see him talking. The guy's kind of, to a degree, getting offended a little bit. He ended up, he was kind of upset that service and didn't come back to church for a long time. Now, he may have been going somewhere else. I don't know. He's a godly man today. I've, no issues with him or anything like that. So I'm not saying anything bad about him. But, the way he was dressed to minister in song, the preacher at the time didn't like that and just caused a disruption there in that service. And caused I was close to that guy, still am. Seeing him not being at church, that really hurt me. And it was, I think, months later, there was like a Christmas special, Christmas skit or something like that I was in, that I had to kind of address the audience before the actual skit started. And he was there, and a lot of family members were there. And man, I was just so choked up with seeing him there. So both the initial event was disruptive, and then when he came back was disruptive, but both for different reasons. One was for, I guess, a negative reason. One was a positive reason. So that was really the only thing that comes out to my mind of something not going right. I couldn't think of any anything like somebody tripping and falling, or I used to run the sound at that church. So there may have been times when I played a track that had the background vocals that wasn't supposed to have. It was just supposed to be the instrumental version. And so the song started and she's like motioning to me and all this stuff. And then she goes, "Oh, that's okay. I'll just sing with whoever the singer was. I'll just sing with him." And so she went ahead and sang the song with him as like it was a duet.
Do you think that the pastor was wrong? Because the pastor has, a duty, I guess.
Right, exactly.
Right, so.
Exactly. And the way he said it was, if you want to attend here in T-shirt and shorts, have no issues with that. But you're getting up, this is a ministry position, a ministry that you're doing, and you need to dress in an appropriate manner for that ministry. And that I can definitely agree with that.
Experience versus, stories. So like Uncle Willie, he would preach revivals and they would sing. And if you know my Uncle Willie, when he plays the piano, he plays it kind of hard. And so they went to a country church, evidently that hadn't been playing the piano for a while, because probably didn't have a piano player or something. So he gets up to play and he's playing pretty hard, and all of these mice just start running out of the service. So I wasn't there, but hearing him tell the story, and Uncle Willie can tell a story, like nobody else. But I'll tell one on myself. Up Barker Ridge, I was there for 5 years. So it's about a 30-minute drive, maybe 40 minutes. And Kim and I we would always stop by the gas station and pick up some candy to kind of eat on the way. We were younger, we could do that. And so I stopped, and my selection of candy that evening was Junior Mints. And that was a mistake because I had accidentally dropped one and I didn't know it. And I had sat on it the whole time. And so I get to church and my dad was there and he said, "Son, what's on the back of your pants?" And I looked and I have this big chocolate spot on the seat of my pants. And I'm like, "Oh, I know what I'll do." I go to the bathroom and try to wipe it off with water. Now I've got a big wet chocolate spot on the back of my pants. And so instead of trying to hide it, I just went ahead and showed everybody before I preached, because I didn't want to be walking around and people see it and be distracted. So that's my ministry funny.
That is probably the best way to handle it.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. Just admit it. Everybody's going to see it. It was you couldn't hide it. It was a big chocolate Junior spot.
It would be the Wasp that everyone was thinking about all service if you didn't mention it.
Yeah.
I can't remember who it was. There was a pastor I remember told about somebody was preaching somewhere, and he was up at the front, and it was kind of a long service, and his family was trying to get his attention while he's up there because he had not completely finished zipping up his pants. And so his family's in the back of the church and they're trying to get his attention, and he's not paying any attention like that. And finally they get a big poster board and they wrote "zip" on it. And the pastor finally sees it, and he didn't get the message quite because he said, "I know some of you want me to zip it up, but I'm not going to do it."
That would be me, not getting what is meant by the sign. I am terrible with lip reading. So if I'm ever up anywhere and somebody's trying to get me to understand what they're saying, don't mouth the words. Come up and tell me, write it on, specifically detailed, write it on a note or a poster board or something.
I have a lot of singing stories because a lot of things go wrong with singing, especially if you're a group coming into a church you've never been to before and you don't know that church's culture and the way they do things. So I could go on and on about stuff like that. But one of the biggest ones I remember right now. So we were booked to sing there for homecoming. It was like 6 months ahead. And so we got there that Sunday, and they were definitely not having a homecoming. We got in the church, before church started and everything. Nobody knew we were coming. Nobody wanted us to be there. That was very obvious. They let us set up. They let us sing. Still didn't care that we were there. And later on, we found out the lady who had booked us didn't tell the church that she had booked us. They had moved the homecoming to the next week, and we weren't booked for that either. And turns out she had been sick and just didn't tell anybody and never got back to church to tell anybody. So that makes for a weird service when you're singing and nobody wants you there. you're listening to this and you've got stories about things that went wrong in your church, send those along with the good things that went on in your church. And we'll see you next time, and hope you join us again for the next episode.
And then they brought in another guy. And the only thing I can remember about him is, man, he prayed longer than anybody.